Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Timepod. This will be the fourth episode in my little history podcast. And I am your host, Tardov. And with me today, I have a friend of mine from Twitter that is called Simon's Rattle. He lives in Britain. So I brought him on to talk about the Wars of the Roses. The introduction is a little bit wonky because we had a little bit of technical issues. And the audio in this episode will be different from the regular audio, like the audio quality you hear right now, because due to the technical issues, I couldn't use this microphone, so we had to switch it up a little bit. But I promise you all, it's a very good episode. It's very funny, so I hope you really enjoy it. And, well, I'm going to fade you right into it right now.
From when I did my history A-level at school, and, you just hear things, and you're like, oh, shit, yeah, Richard of York. He's the guy that walked up the top of the hill and then walked back down again and lost 10,000 men, and... Yeah, it's pretty.
Well,
it's pretty mental.
It's pretty interesting doing this topic overall because we don't cover it in Swedish schools, so we. So I feel like it's really interesting reading it.
Mm-hmm.
Mostly because we don't do it, as I said, because it's not a very. Wait, I'm gonna boost my microphone. Wait. Maybe it's getting better.
Yeah, that is better.
Is it better now?
Yeah, much better.
All right. So one thing we don't read about this in Swedish schools, because it's very very local history, sort of still. So it's really interesting reading about it. And for everyone listening right now, we're of course talking about Wars of the Roses, and it's basically, as I would like to call it, it's the Game of Thrones in real life, more or less.
Yeah, there's quite a lot of heavy influence, I think. I've not actually ever seen Game of Thrones because it doesn't really interest me, that kind of TV program, but I hear there's a lot of heavy influence from this story. So
the books were written influenced by this. So George R.R. Martin, that wrote the books, basically used Wars of the Roses, and then he wrote the books, and then it became a TV show. But you could have easily just made a historical accurate one and made the show equally interesting, basically.
Yeah, a lot of the things I've been watching, it feels like they've dramatized a lot of this, and then I read up and I'm like, oh, they didn't dramatize this at all. This is crazy.
No, they didn't need really to write it up because it's the entire history is kind of kind of fucked. It's your typical historical. It's a typical medieval history. Where everything is shit, and then more things become shit, and then everything shitty comes together, creating more shit, and eventually it just ends up in a massive pile of shit. That's just, I love it. It's it's a great kind of history.
I think this is good for you as well, because it was your last one, wasn't it? There was the Black Plague, and that kind of Black Plague and the 100 Years' War kind of lay the backdrop for the Wars of the Roses. So
my latest one was the Songhai, but this one will work well with the Black Plague episode correctly. So what was the effects of Wars of the Roses? It ended about 100-year-long struggle about an heir to the throne. It basically, England was ruled by people that weren't really legit to the throne to begin with, and that's why all of this happens. And the Wars of the Roses eventually finishes up that, right? You come to a conclusion in which you have a rightful heir to the throne and a new type of era starts. You basically kill off everyone that was there was
spoiler alert there. Yeah, pretty much everybody's killed off in this. But yeah, it changed the entire the family that held the throne, and we go into a well-known era of history after this, the Tudor era.
Yeah.
So the next king after this, Henry VII, is the first of the Tudors, which they kind of, there's a lot that came out the Tudor era that was you can still see around England today, and similar with the Wars of the Roses. So a lot of people won't know that the rivalry between Manchester United and Leeds United are the White Rose versus the Red Rose. So you can trace that history all the way back. Lancaster and Yorkshire hating each other for as long as I can remember. Well, as long as anyone can remember, as long as history goes back. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah. I didn't know that. That's
I've got a funny story. I was in a pub and watching an England match. I don't really like football at all, but I was watching an England match in 2012, and I was wearing a Manchester United shirt, and I had a bottle thrown at the back of my head because I was in Leeds, and they just don't like Manchester United that much that they're willing to throw bottles at you, and I just thought, oh shit.
All right. So there's a little bit of a rivalry going on.
Yeah.
All right. So maybe we didn't actually settle the Wars of the Roses really. It just settled it politically, and then let everyone else do their own reigns. But either way, this conflict goes back quite a bit. I would say that. We can go as far back as like Henry II, and King Louis in 1216. That was part of the time when England controlled part of France, and basically it's a little bit hard back then in the 1200s. It's a little bit hard to tell where England begins and where England starts, because you have a big control area in France. This would later lead into some uprising, and we all know the story about Joan of Arc. She is part of this as well. Basically. And eventually England loses France, and you go back to having troubles with the Scots. And which you always have for some reason. The Scots will always be unruly. And then you had this is kind of interesting. I wrote this down yesterday. I only wrote it down in words, but so Edward I ruled Scotland, and then Robert the Bruce ruled Scotland. And then Edward II, Prince of Wales, were to fight Scotland, but he was rejected as a king because he was gay.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Well, I say gay, but I would say that maybe he was just not very interested in things, but history writes it at least as he was gay, and that he couldn't get air, and that caused some problems. And then instead of him, the Earl of Lancaster started acting as king, and now we have gone about 100 years already. It's kind of the problem with talking about these kind of things, because you have to jump in the timeline so fast, unless you're gonna do biographies about everyone.
Yeah, there's a lot of characters in this, so
there is too many characters, and god damn, you need to name people something else than Henry, because like there are so many Henrys. In 1326, England was invaded by France, and then after that, Edward III went after France again. So it's basically Sweden and Denmark, but England and France. And
Yeah, that's a good observation. France is known as the old enemy, so we there's a lot of you can trace all of this kind of hatred all the way up to World War II as well, and there's some pretty derogatory things that most English people will say about the French.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to go into them here. I love my French colleagues. So
yeah, I think there really is a lot of that, because then Philip of France took control of all British merchants, basically taking them over without Britain approving it, and that's basically where we are at the 100-Year War. It's ridiculous how fast I go through my own notes here. It's
the 100-Year War starts getting a little bit interesting in this. We're talking about the time Shakespeare starts making writing some of these plays afterwards, obviously, but he writes some plays about this, and you hear about some of the characters. Henry V in particular. The Battle of Agincourt is another pretty important battle, but basically Henry V conquers quite a lot of France, and I always love this. So he conquers France so that he can marry the daughter of the defeated king.
Yeah.
How does that work?
It's just how it is. Don't question it, because it's there is a lot of that in medieval history that is just why. Why?
I'm going to kill all of your men just so I can take your daughter. It's just crazy.
Yeah, so after that, during the 100-Year War, we had the invasion of Normandy, and then you had Richard II, Duke of Lancaster, basically making a riot. And then he is forced to abdicate and is eventually assassinated. And Henry IV is not a real heir, but here is where the Wars of the Roses really start, because Henry IV is can't really claim the throne, but claims it anyway. And that fucks up this line, basically. The real heir is, of course, Richard III, I think. No, he's not alive by then. Wait.
No, not Richard. Not Richard yet. Not Richard of York. It's one of the other houses.
Yeah, Duke of York.
Duke of York. Yeah, Richard Neville. I think it is.
He's the real heir of the throne. But Henry IV sees it, or his parents do. Then he dies, and then Henry V. He got crowned because Henry IV was mentally ill in some capacity. I think he had a stroke, but they didn't really have any words for that. So he started losing memory. He couldn't walk. He couldn't talk. He didn't understand what people said to him. It sounds like a classic stroke. But then Henry V took over. And then you had the Battle of Agincourt, as you talked about, in which
we could do an entire podcast on his reign through France. So Henry V was actually a really brave king, really well renowned king, and defeated. There's rumours there of Agincourt that it was 6,000 to 10,000 British soldiers versus 30 to 35,000 French soldiers. And there's a whole load of other things out there. There's the end of chivalry, which I didn't know until I started doing research on this, which is really interesting. So French soldiers had a code of battle known as chivalry, and English soldiers just decided to ruin all of that and go around and kill all of these French people, which they weren't meant to do. That you weren't ever meant to kill noble. You were meant to capture noble people. so you could sell them back.
Yeah, basically, that's how medieval battles usually worked. You took the rich ones because they meant money, and then you tried to sell them back, and that's how when we read history, when you wonder why certain people never fucking dies, that's because they're just captured and sold back. They're never killed.
Well, Henry VI, as we'll come on to, he was captured quite a lot. I'm sure we're going to get onto that.
I'm just going to go grab some tea. Be right back.
Okay.
1 minute. All right. And then you have, let's see. That was the Battle of Agincourt, and that battle alone is quite something, but because it's basically, as you said, it ended chivalry, but it also was the one of the few times where Mother Nature said, no, you're not winning this one to France, and they had to, and it basically drowned in clay or whatever.
Yeah. I've heard this. It's quite something, and the battle setup as well. So you had men on the English side, about 1,000 to 1,500. I forget the name of them, but they're well armored men that go and they fight with swords. And then you had something like 5,500 archers.
Are you meaning like men at arms?
Men of the arms, that's the word, versus France, who were they didn't like archers. They only liked men of the arms and horse riders, so they had tons and tons of them, but the field just turned into mud, and they got absolutely hammered by the English archers, and then they were trying to run down and storm the English guys, and just fell over in the mud and got crucified.
Yeah, I got some numbers for the Battle of Agincourt, and the English were about 6,000 to 9,000, so I would put it at about an 8,000. And the French army, this is a little bit sketchy because it depends on the sources, but about 20,000, I think, is what I think.
It's a really interesting... It's a really interesting, the contemporary sources at the time, because England obviously were wanting to big up how good their victory was.
Yeah.
French nobles were wanting to say how shit their loss was, so they could beat the king with a stick and say, hey, you were really shit.
Yeah, so it really makes the sources a little bit unreliable here. When it comes to numbers, because either side wants to either play down their size or play up their size.
But can you imagine that battlefield though, with just like literally thousands and thousands of dead bodies in a load of clay?
Yeah, it's just picturing it, it's fucked. Because. Well, casualties basically were the France lost 6,000 men, according to some sources, and the British lost only 112 to about 600. But I think that's a little bit low.
That sounds low.
It sounds really low.
In all fairness, they would have lost more soldiers to dysentery when they first landed, because they I can't remember the name of the castle that they landed in when they first landed in France. But they were there for too long, and they just basically everybody got diarrhea, and loads of people died.
Which kind of brings me to Henry V, because he shit himself to death in 1422, making Henry VI the new king. So that's that's dysentery. It basically makes you shit yourself to death. It's also called like the battlefield plague or the soldier plague, basically. And Henry VI, he's only 10 months old when he becomes... Well, he doesn't become king, but he's the rightful heir. And when he was that young, England was eventually kicked out of France for like the third time or something like that, because of Joan of Arc, and the 100-Year War was over, which brought basically the possibility to create this inner conflict in England instead, because you always gotta have a conflict for some reason. you can't stop fighting. It's just, and then
the problem was that when we didn't have fights going on, all of the army or the armed men in the UK got really angry, so started killing and raping and pillaging other villages instead. So it's easier to go and do that to France, I think, than to do it to our own villages.
Yeah, not that it stopped them, but yeah.
No.
Basically. Then Joan of Arc was eventually executed. France was a little bit more stable because Britain didn't have time to fight with them because they didn't have a king. And that's where Richard, Duke of York, was rightful heir. And I mean, this whole thing, I looked at a family timeline or family chart or family tree or whatever you call it, and this entire situation is kind of fucked. It's really hard to understand because there are the reason Richard, Duke of York is rightful heir is because his father had an uncle that was the son of the rightful heir, something like that. It's stupid.
Yeah.
But I gotta compliment the medieval scribes because they're really good at keeping track of this. Unlike, today, we're not really as good at keeping track on things like this because it gets real messy.
No, it's just all over Twitter and it's all lies. If this was going on today, it would be all over Twitter, Facebook.
Yeah. It would be threads on like kiwi farms, like trying to figure out who was the real king.
Yeah, Richard Neville would be shitposting against Henry VI.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so Richard wanted that power, and that's why we had the Wars of the Roses, basically.
Yeah. It's an interesting start. So Henry marries Margaret of Anjou, and the fight really, because Henry VI is well known as just a useless, a stupid king, like really scared. Goes in and out of consciousness quite a lot.
I listened to the In Our Time podcast of BBC4 about Wars of the Roses. It's not a particularly good episode, but it brings that up a lot. That Henry VI was basically a fruit. It's just a vegetable, and he wouldn't do anything. He's spoken about as if he listens, but he never speaks himself. He laughs along with jokes, but that's it. Basically, it doesn't do anything. And therefore, but one thing I found interesting here is that Richard wasn't actually after to put Henry VI off the throne. He was after to make sure that he was the rightful heir. Because he was pretty sure that Henry VI would die off, or someone would kill him, or something.
Or he wouldn't have an heir himself. Would then leave Richard Neville as the rightful heir. Because he did. But Henry becomes king in November 1429.
Yeah.
At 8 years old, and becomes the king of France as well, or the disputed king of France, the year after.
Yeah.
So 1430. There's quite some time before anything really kicks off. Then, like you say, you've got Joan of Arc going on in France at the time.
Yeah, and Margaret handled most things for Henry VI anyways, so she is basically the rightful king. And Richard III, his quest for the king was not carried over to his son. His son wasn't really that interested in the title for some reason. I didn't find out why. But basically, what happens? This is the Wars of the Roses. Is basically a civil war. It's not really a civil war. It has its clashes, but it's I don't know. It's a power struggle. I understand why historians are hesitating to calling it a civil war, but
it doesn't. It doesn't because it kind of filters out, and then there's just these small little battles that go on all over. I mean, it's a bloody time, and the throne, the kingdom, or whatever, changes hands 6 times in 30 years, which is just pretty crazy.
Yeah, that's true. Henry VI. Well, you have the Battle of Wakefield. That happens. That's where Richard III gets half his head chopped off.
Oh shit! That fucker just stabbed me with a sword. Shit!
And his brains fall out, and that was what we knew about him until 2014 when people found his grave under a parking lot, which is that's just great.
There's something quite funny happened with that as well. So we found him in a car park in Leicester, and then because he'd had a royal funeral, but we didn't ever have his body, he had to have a royal funeral. So we had a royal funeral for him in 2015, I think it was.
Yeah.
It's just the guy's been dead for 700 years or 600 years. We have a royal funeral.
It's really weird because when you read the chronicles from the time being, basically what they know is that his brain fell out, and then they don't know where they took his body, because what he did do on these battlefields was when you killed the king, you stowed him away somewhere, because you didn't want to recognize him as that, as that powerful figure. That is why we didn't know where his body went. So, but it's kind of great that of all fucking places you find him, and how someone else didn't find him before that is kind of, because the parking lot is a rather new invention, right? So.
But the ridiculous thing is, we've had rumors about this for literally the last, when I was doing history when I was 10, 11, maybe 12 years old, we were talking about it then, and we were saying, look, he's probably in a car park in Leicestershire. And then we found him. It was like, what the? Why didn't you try and find him before?
Yeah, I don't know the story of how they found him, but it's just great. Whenever I read that on his Wikipedia page or something, I just smile a lot, because it's morbid, but it's kind of fucking funny. And then Henry VI becomes captured in 1470, but then he becomes king again for some reason.
Yeah, it's quite an interesting turn of events. The Duke of Warwick, Earl of Warwick, Kingmaker, was trying to get another king onto the throne because he wanted to dethrone Edmund.
Yeah.
Because they had a falling out, which is actually quite interesting. So 1461 maybe. They had a falling out because Edward wanted to. Well, the Earl of Warwick was trying to marry off Edward to a French queen so that they could cement more power in France. And rather than doing that, so he negotiated a contract and he had everything signed off. And then whilst, or maybe slightly before all of that had been concluded, Edward married just like a small noblewoman who, by all accounts, was absolutely gorgeous. The only reason he married her, from what I've seen and what I've heard, is because she wouldn't have sex with him until they were married. And he was just obsessed. So he slept with everybody and anybody he could, but he fell entirely in lust with this girl, and she said, "No, until you make me queen, I'm not going to take my knickers off for you."
Oh shit! What a power move!
I know.
Absolute power move.
Absolute power move. So, and she, in doing that, because she's really loyal to her own family, she kind of makes her family from quite small nobility to being like in the royal family, and that pisses off a lot of people. The Earl of Warwick in particular, because it's effectively just like having, there's some parallels at the minute, but there's a lot of racism in those parallels actually, because it's kind of like the lady that's just married Harry. So there's it's that level of scandal.
Oh,
like
right, yeah.
A married or formerly married woman, because she was this lady, I forget her name. She had already been widowed once. She already had 2 kids. She wasn't high up in nobility, and yet she marries the king. So real power move, and really pissed off the Earl of Warwick.
We have a similar story in Sweden about King Eric the 14th. He marries a
Eric the 14th. You guys keep saying we've got too many Henrys, and you've got Eric the 14th.
yeah, that's true. But only one Eric was king, so you don't have to keep track of all of them.
Anyway, yeah.
So he marries basically a farmer's daughter called Karin Månsdotter, and that was of course outrageous. Like, what are you doing, man? What the fuck? And basically, why he did it? First of all, he did it to spite everyone else because he didn't like anyone, and he was like a paranoid schizophrenic, so. He was crazy, so everything he did just to spite everyone else, and that was one of the ways to do it. She was good for him though, but it eventually caused his brother to try to assassinate him and stuff like that. It's what do you call it? It's like Game of Thrones, but Sweden. It's also a really interesting story. These kind of what do you call it? Rebellious monarchs. They're weird.
It gets worse with Edward though, because there was someone that some of the people that married into that family. So there's I think he was a 21-year-old brother of the new queen who married a 65-year-old noblewoman for a position of power. But then. There's another member of the family that Edward says that he can't marry for love like he did. He has to marry for position and power, which is just so hypocritical. But then I guess you can do that when you're the king, can't you? You can just say, no, fuck it, I'll do what I want to do. Yeah. Do as I say, I do.
Kind of. You can kind of do that, but then you have to reap what you sow. Which is usually how these monarchs end, because eventually your bullshit is gonna get caught up with you. It's like
and this bullshit didn't catch up with Edward. He learned the hard way that he needed to be more ruthless, which is why the Earl of Warwick gets killed in a fight in a battle. And then when that happens, Edward also kills Henry VI.
Oh,
Although that's disputed. So they say Henry VI died of natural causes, but then there was blood and a massive wound on the back of his head.
Yeah,
so
I wrote down that he was assassinated in the Tower of London.
Which is after his third visit.
I couldn't really find any sources to really confirm that, but I was like, no, this is bullshit. I'm not. Of course it was killed.
He kept on getting put in the Tower of London as well, and then getting released. But basically, he was such a useless king that honestly, it reminds me of the game of chess, because the Queen. I mean, we're going back to Margaret of Anjou again here, but the Queen was so powerful and so outmaneuvering everybody, and the king is just so pathetic and could only make small steps, like one step. So it just reminds me a lot of the game of chess, and I've been trying to find out whether or not that's where chess comes from. I don't think it is, but it just reminds me so much of it.
But it's an interesting observation, I would say, because it kind of now that you say it, now that you repeat it to me, that feels like it would be some kind of connection there, because.
Yeah, it really does. But I'm gonna have to find the etymology of chess. But so Henry VI was killed off then, and you've got Edward actually does quite well. I don't think he gets murdered. I think he just dies.
Edward just dies.
It leaves his son, who's 11 years old, to be the king. But before that happens, Richard III kills him off and takes over the kingship himself.
Yeah.
And then locks the other two heirs to the throne in the tower.
Yeah, this is quite a famous story. Because we never see them again.
No, never see them. So there's some reports of them playing outside of the tower, and that have been seen playing outside of the tower, but they're never seen again.
Yeah.
After those last reports.
And I'm not sure that they have been found either.
No, I was just joking with my partner that they're probably still in there.
Yeah,
still alive.
This is a weird thing talking about history, because some things are so, royally fucked up that you can't do anything but laugh at it while the thing is actually really horrible. But it's like there's no other way to talk about it. Like this is obviously a horrible situation, but it's also, I don't know how you talk about it in another way.
We have to laugh.
Yeah, because
the guy who drowned in a vat of wine.
Yeah.
Did you come across that when you were doing the research? I'm trying to find it. I can't remember John somebody or other.
No, I didn't do that, but
Clarence, George Plantagenet, who he died in a barrel of wine.
I kind of want to die that way, so it's like that. It's an horrible way to die.
That way last night.
I mean, it's better than Eric XIV, who died by eating pea soup that was poisoned. So he got picked off. Way more boring, but it's kind of a legend as well. I can't really say that the sources are correct on that one, but so they locked away the kids, and then everyone basically died off. And the problem with this war is that it basically kills off all the heirs to the throne, which makes it so whenever we come to the end, it's going to be Henry Tudor that makes an appearance, and he starts off that by getting captured.
Yeah,
because of course, and he has no rightful claim to the throne really, but everyone else is dead. So that's basically how they put him there.
It's a very interesting. Henry VII, Henry Tudor, how he got to the throne is just compliments to his mother for being that determined. So she had him when she was 13, and it was a painful birth, and it left her unable to bear any more children. She then just makes a load of really tactical, clever moves, and
yeah. Did you die? Yes.
Hello?
Yeah, there you are. You disappeared.
That's probably my.
Yeah. You were talking about how Henry VII's mom did some really power moves.
Yeah, some great power moves. Like just the right marriages at the right time, sucking up to the right kings. Like she was on both sides. She was on Henry VI's side. She was on Edward IV's side. She was on Richard III's side, and then she turned on Richard III and cemented her son's accession to the throne. Really fascinating story. And I said that the Wars of the Rose are actually punctuated by some really strong women. Margaret Banju and Henry VII's mum. And Henry VII's mum, I found out, is absolutely fascinating. She outlives Henry VII and is alive for Henry VIII taking the throne.
Oh, shit.
Yeah,
I didn't know that.
2-3 weeks after Henry VIII accedes the throne, which is just, 60s, I think? She's going to be in her 60s, which is just unheard of, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that is really interesting. I didn't know that. But researching for this episode overall has been quite a mess, because you kind of want to dig into all the characters, but if you start doing that, you're gonna lose the plot really fast. It's because there are so many people involved in this. Fine.
I think we've given quite a good overview there, which is got us all the way through about 100 or 200 years.
That's why I did the quick summary in the beginning from 1216 and went over all the characters and stuff like that. Kill them off one by one, just so we don't have to talk about it, because it's really, really a lot of history going into this. But basically what happens, as we said, is that the Tudor the two houses, the Lancaster and the York house, basically becomes one. Yeah, and that's the Tudors. And then they are going to rule England from this time on. So basically, I would say there's a lot to say about this overall, but I would say that basically Wars of the Roses is kind of a send-off, like a farewell to the medieval era overall.
And that's it's quite a fitting send-off. It's the end of that dynasty. So it's the longest serving, or was the longest serving dynasty of the English monarchs. So for over 300 years they're on the throne, the Plantagenets. And then
we would go into the Renaissance.
Basically. And then we start getting some really fun times. So Henry VIII changes the focus from France to Italy. So
by the end of this, we can talk a little bit about Europe overall. Italy is really heavy into the Renaissance, or what we refer to as the Renaissance. Other countries are a little bit, behind. Like Scandinavia is not really there yet, but Sweden is taking form around 1520, 1530, and we're starting to seeing a really new political landscape in Europe after this conflict. And without this conflict, I don't know if Britain and France would have been so powerful, because it basically settles, the rules for them and how they are going to be ruled and what areas are each one's areas. So basically, I think the Wars of the Roses has a really kind of, what do you call it, like a butterfly effect.
It really does. Even in just like the kind of micro environment in the UK, it's got some really big knock-on effects, because if Henry Tudor hadn't got acceded to the throne, you wouldn't have had Henry VIII. You wouldn't have had Protestants and Catholics warring. You wouldn't have had the Civil War. So it goes on and it goes on and on.
Yeah, I kind of wonder how without this happening, how the 30-year-old war would look, the 30 Years' War, because it would be entirely different, the battlefield overall. I don't remember how much England was involved in that, but no, but England would have had a much more split country, and possibly would have had to join eventually. We know that France stood tall in that war, but so basically the Wars of the Roses is very local. It's very, as you call it, microenvironment, but it's also really important in order to settle power in Europe. And let's see. And without a secure heir or a secure family to take over the throne, it would have thrown Britain off later, like how Britain became an empire and how it started colonizing things. If it would still be insecure within the nation itself, it wouldn't be able to do all that, because it would have to focus about local politics or stuff like that. And so all of this is just basically the Wars of the Roses is the climax of 400 years of history almost. It's just, this is where all the bullshit ends and England starts getting its shit together, basically.
Yeah, let's hope that happens again soon, eh? Let's hope that all of the bullshit in this country ends and we start getting our shit together, and we actually maybe we won't become as powerful an empire, but maybe we'll stop just having petty fights over nonsense.
Yeah, it's kind of something that I really like when reading about English history, is that a lot of the shit is just petty. It's just bullshit. It's just, why are you doing this? And I felt a lot of that when I was reading up for this episode as well. I was like, all of this is bullshit. This is like how I like how you basically invented a system to take over the throne, a system that is inherently so fucking flawed that it can't be solved without battle. It's it's pretty impressive, I gotta say. It's really, really, really interesting, and I went to look up the 30 Years' War now and see if I could find anything. Scotland was in it. No, England was in it as well.
Ah, okay.
As anti-Habsburg allies. So they probably lended troops, I think.
Yeah.
Sweden is... Why is Sweden listed under England? We're a pretty big deal. during that war.
We're intrinsically linked. Sweden and England will always be linked.
Oh yeah. Here we are. England and Scotland was with the Swedish forces. Of course you are. Just going in and starting shit. That's how we do it.
Go in, fuck shit up, leave.
Yeah,
that's the best way to do it.
That's basically what Sweden did as well. So it's just we went in, we fucked shit up, got our king killed. We didn't stop there. It was like, all right, so you killed our king, so now we're gonna fuck more shit up, and and then we took over the Balkans. So it's
like, cool.
Yeah. All right. So this conversation was fun.
Yeah.
I think we have gone through most of it, even if we didn't dig into super detail on everything. But
yeah.
So I think we got it all.
I mean, there's loads of different bits that would be really interesting to go and dig into and like really go through and maybe in the future we can think about that.
There are definitely parts of this conflict that can be entirely their own episodes because it's because it's a lot. I was a little bit afraid that this wouldn't be. We could do this in one sitting, but as I started to blasting through my notes in the beginning there, I realized that this is going to be perfect. It's like, this is going to be fine. And it turned out fine. It turned out to be a great episode. It's
been good fun, and as I say, it's been good fun to read about, and I'd love to go into more depth on some of it in the future, or maybe there's other bits of English history that we could look at. But yeah, it's been good fun.
Yeah, like we have, for example, we have the Battle of Evesham. We didn't go through. We didn't go through. The Battle of Wakefield, that more than that Richard III got his head chopped off, and
we didn't go through how Richard Neville died as well, which is just basically the picture book of arrogance. Yeah. He could have. He had 6,000 men, and Margaret of Anjou raised an army to come and kill him, and she had 12,000 men. And he was holed up in a castle for all of Christmas. And rather than, so he could have just waited for more of his men to arrive, but rather than do that, he got really bored. So it's like, sod this, I'm going to go out and do some foraging myself. And he got captured and killed.
Clever girl.
And it's even so they chopped his head off and put his head on a pike and put a paper, because he was calling himself the Lord Protector, but they said that was without just cause. So they put a paper crown around his head, soaked in his own blood, and then just had his head like parading around.
Jesus Christ! Like, oh yeah. I kind of started understanding why the Romans.
I lost you, but that's probably a good as time as any.
I was just about to finish this up, but I was gonna say, and I start to understand why the Romans called the Britons barbarians. Like, it's
yeah, very much so.
Yeah, but thank you so much for hanging out with me.
Anytime.
I will probably call on you whenever I do another episode on British or English history overall. And I want to thank everyone that might listen to this episode while it's out. And you can always suggest things for me to cover. I apparently have some kind of self-harm issue in which I just drown myself in historical texts. And this is not an exception. But thank you so much for hanging out with me. You will find this episode whenever it's out.
Brilliant, thanks, and I'll speak to you online soon.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cheers.
Cheers. I want to thank everyone for listening to this episode. If you want to follow us, you will find the links in the various descriptions. Me is Tardle on Twitter, and Simon is Simon's Rattle on Twitter as well. I really encourage you to do that. You can find this episode on iTunes, Spotify, Podbean, and YouTube. So thank you for listening, and thank you for understanding that the sound quality of this episode was a little bit of a technical nightmare for us, but I hope you enjoyed it anyway. So until next time, I thank you very much.